ancient Rome, there was once a mother who carefully placed her teenage son on the throne of the world, and years later, that same son calmly ordered her death. Her name was Agrippina the Younger. She did not conquer Rome with armies, and she did not rule with a crown. She ruled by standing so close to power that no one noticed she was shaping it. This is the quiet story of how a woman built an emperor, and how that emperor slowly learned he did not want to be built. Agrippina was born into the very center of the Roman imperial family, where power was not distant or mysterious, but present in the rooms she walked through as a child, living in the conversations around her, and shaping the fate of everyone she knew. Her father was admired across the empire. Her mother carried the dignity of the imperial line, and her brother would one day sit on the throne of Rome. From the beginning, Agrippina understood that Rome did not run on strength alone. It ran on proximity. She also learned very early that being close to power was never the same as being safe. Members of her family were exiled, others were quietly removed, and favor could turn into suspicion overnight. The palace was not a home, but a place where survival required patience, observation, and silence. So Agrippina learned to be patient. She learned to watch more than she spoke, and to wait for moments when others were distracted. Years passed, emperors changed, alliances shifted, and violence rearranged the order of the palace more than once. Through all of this, Agrippina remained careful and still, like someone studying the rhythm of a dangerous current before stepping into the water. When her brother was killed and her uncle Claudius became emperor, Rome felt unstable and uncertain, but Agrippina saw an opening. She returned from exile older, calmer, and far more observant than before. She did not rush toward influence, but allowed herself to become familiar again inside the palace, becoming someone Claudius trusted, someone safe to speak with, someone who seemed to ask for nothing. In time, she became his wife. To outsiders, it was unusual for an emperor to marry his own niece. But inside the palace, unusual things were rarely questioned if they brought comfort to the emperor, and Agrippina brought comfort. Yet comfort was not her goal. Access was. From an earlier marriage she had a son, a quiet boy with a long name that few people remembered. History would remember him simply as Nero. Agrippina's thoughts settled around one idea. If she could not sit on the throne herself, she could place someone there who belonged entirely to her. She began speaking gently to Claudius about the future of Rome, about stability, about legacy, and about the importance of choosing the right successor. She never forced the conversation and allowed the idea to grow slowly, as though it had been born in Claudius's own mind. Eventually, Nero was adopted, and the emperor's biological son was quietly moved aside in the line of succession. Rome noticed small details. Coins appeared showing Agrippina's face beside the emperor's. Her presence in official matters became impossible to ignore. Senators grew used to seeing her involved in discussions normally reserved for men. Yet, Agrippina never appeared ambitious. She appeared calm. She moved through the palace like someone gently rearranging a room, while everyone else believed nothing had changed. Then Claudius died. Some said illness. Others whispered about a favorite meal prepared with unusual care. No one spoke loudly about it, because in Rome, certain suspicions were safer when left unspoken. Nero became emperor at 16, young, impressionable, and entirely shaped by the careful path his mother had prepared. At first, Agrippina stood beside him, helping him understand letters from governors, advising him before meetings, present in ways that felt natural and almost invisible. To many, it seemed as though Rome was being ruled by a mother through her son, and for a time that was true. But as Nero grew older, something began to change. What once felt like guidance began to feel like control. and what once felt like protection began to feel like a shadow he could not escape. He began to step away, first gently with fewer meetings and separate residences, then more firmly with guards removed, messages unanswered, and doors that once opened now remaining closed. Agrippina, who had spent her life understanding how power moved, now found herself standing slightly outside of it, and Nero, the boy she had placed on the throne, began to see her as something dangerous. He tried subtle solutions at first. There was a boat prepared to collapse while she sailed upon it, an accident meant to appear natural. But Agrippina survived and swam to shore in darkness, older now but still stubbornly alive. In the end, Nero abandoned subtlety and sent men to her home with clear instructions. They found her in her villa. She did not run, and she did not beg, because she understood perhaps better than anyone how Rome worked. When the blade was raised, she pointed to her stomach and told them to strike there first, the place that had once carried Nero. Her life ended in a strange, quiet clarity. A woman who had built an emperor was undone by the very person she had created. Rome as always continued. The palace remained polished, the corridors remained quiet, and servants walked softly across the same marble floors. But something had shifted. Agrippina had shown that a woman in Rome did not need a crown to rule. She only needed patience, proximity, and time, and she would not be the last Roman woman to discover how quietly dangerous it was to stand so close to power. In Rome, people rarely spoke loudly about the emperor's household, but they spoke about it constantly in low voices, in kitchens, in courtyards, and in the shaded corners of markets. Long before anything became official, long before accusations were written down, the city was already quietly aware of the young empress, Valeria Messalina. She had arrived at the palace very young, almost too young for the heavy stillness of imperial life, and from the beginning there was something about her that did not seem to match the slow, cautious rhythm of the place. Where others walked carefully, Messalina moved lightly. Where others measured their words, she seemed to speak without calculation. It was not rebellion, and it was not ambition. It was something softer and far more unsettling. She behaved as though the rules inside the palace were suggestions rather than boundaries. Married to Emperor Claudius, Messalina lived at the center of Rome's most powerful residence, yet she often appeared restless there. The days inside the palace were repetitive and formal, filled with ceremonies, documents, and long conversations about matters that rarely changed from one week to the next. Claudius buried himself in administration, content with routine and structure. Messalina, by contrast, drifted through the vast halls as though searching for something the palace could not provide. Servants began to notice how often unfamiliar faces entered through quieter doors. Guards learned to look away at the right moments. The palace, which was built on observation, slowly became a place where certain things were deliberately unseen. What made Messalina's behavior unusual was not simply that she formed relationships outside her marriage, but the ease with which she did so. There was no sign of fear in her movements, no sign that she expected consequences. Men who found themselves in her company often discovered that being near the empress carried unexpected benefits. Positions changed hands, favors were granted, small decisions made in private rooms shaped events that later unfolded in public. Without ever attending councils or debating policies, Messalina's private world began to brush quietly against the political world of Rome. Stories about her spread beyond the palace walls, carried gently from person to person. Some of these stories were exaggerated, others imagined, but many were close enough to truth that they became difficult to dismiss. What unsettled Rome was not simply the scandal, but the sense that the empress behaved as though she were untouched by the very system that confined everyone else. She moved through the city with a freedom that felt almost unreal, as if she believed that standing beside the emperor placed her somewhere outside the reach of ordinary consequence. Among the many people drawn into her orbit was a senator named Gaius Silius. He was respected, ambitious, and already married, but Messalina's attention had a way of reshaping priorities. Their meetings became frequent enough that they were no longer hidden from those who watched carefully. Conversations lingered, glances were exchanged in public spaces. The line between secrecy and openness began to blur. Still, Claudius remained unaware, absorbed in governance and trusting the quiet routines of his household. As time passed, Messalina's confidence grew into something bolder. What had once been discreet became increasingly visible. She and Silius began to imagine a life that did not rely on secrecy, a life where their connection did not need to hide behind curtains and side entrances. In a decision that surprised even those who had grown used to palace rumors, they chose to formalize their relationship. While Claudius was away from Rome, Messalina and Silius went through a marriage ceremony. It was not whispered. It was not disguised. Witnesses were present. Vows were spoken. For a brief moment, it was as though the emperor simply did not exist. When word reached Claudius, confusion came first, then disbelief. Advisors struggled to explain how such an event could happen within the imperial household without his see. Knowledge, what had once seemed like youthful indulgence, now appeared as something far more serious. This was no longer a private matter of desire. It was a public disruption of imperial authority. For the first time, the whispers surrounding Messalina rose high enough that they could not be ignored. Claudius acted quickly, guided by those who feared what this meant for Rome's stability. Messalina and Silius were arrested. The palace that had once felt wide and permissive now seemed narrow and quiet. There were no dramatic arguments, no long defenses. The decision was swift. Silius was executed, and soon after, Messalina faced the same end. The young empress who had moved so freely through the halls of power now stood without protection, without influence, and without time. Her death was quiet compared to the noise of her life. No crowds gathered, no public spectacle followed. Rome absorbed the event in the same way it absorbed everything else, turning it into a lesson, a warning, and a story that would be repeated for years in softened voices. Afterward, the palace returned to its slow rhythm. Curtains were drawn open, floors were clean, conversations resumed. Yet something of Messalina's presence lingered faintly in the memory of those who had watched her move through those spaces. She had shown that standing beside power could create the illusion of freedom, an illusion strong enough to make someone forget how fragile that position truly was. In Rome, desire and danger often walked side by side so quietly that it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Messalina lived as though that line did not exist, as though proximity to the emperor placed her somewhere beyond it. But inside the imperial household, no one remained beyond consequence for long, and others would soon discover that power could be approached in very different, much quieter ways. In Rome, most women learned that silence kept them safe, but Fulvia seemed to believe the opposite, that silence allowed things to fall apart. Long before she became known as the wife of Mark Antony, she was already known as someone who stepped forward when others stepped back. She did not raise her voice, and she did not seek attention, but she had a way of remaining present in moments when tension filled the air, as though she felt responsible for what might happen next. Rome, which was accustomed to women fading quietly into the background of political life, did not quite know what to make of her. Fulvia had lived through enough unrest to understand how quickly public order in Rome could change. Riots, speeches, trials, and sudden shifts of loyalty were part of the city's rhythm. She listened carefully to debates in the forum. She watched how crowds responded to certain names. Over time, she developed a sense for the emotional currents of Rome, the way unease could gather long before it became visible. When Julius Caesar was killed and the city fell into uncertainty, Fulvia did not treat it as distant politics. She felt it as something immediate, something that required presence rather than distance. When Antony emerged as one of the central figures in the struggle for control, Fulvia remained beside him, not as decoration, but as quiet support. She appeared in public with him, listened to conversations, and allowed her presence to be noticed without forcing it. This persistence made her familiar to people in a way that felt unusual for a woman in her position. She became associated with Antony's name not through speeches, but through simple, steady visibility. As tensions grew between Antony and Octavian, the atmosphere in Rome began to tighten. Antony spent more time away from the city, focused on wider campaigns, while uncertainty at home grew heavier. Supporters of Antony became restless. Rumors spread. People began to wonder who was truly guiding events inside the city, while its most powerful men were elsewhere. Fulvia did not wait for clarity. She began speaking quietly with those who still felt loyal to Antony. Veterans, local leaders, old allies. She met them in calm conversations, reminding them of shared history and past promises. She did not speak of rebellion. She spoke of preservation, of holding things steady, until Antony returned. These conversations slowly turned into something more organized. Supplies were gathered, groups of supporters formed. What had begun as emotional loyalty took on the shape of practical action. To many Romans, it felt strange to see a woman connected so closely to preparations that resembled military effort. Yet Fulvia never presented herself as a commander. She spoke as someone safeguarding Antony's place in Rome during his absence. This framing allowed her actions to seem less like defiance and more like duty, even as the situation gradually moved toward open conflict. Eventually, the tension broke into what later became known as the Perusine War. Cities were drawn into the dispute, troops maneuvered, negotiations failed. Through it all, Fulvia remained calm and visible, believing that maintaining pressure would force Antony's rivals to reconsider their position. She trusted that loyalty and persistence would be enough to hold things together. But war does not respond gently to intention. As Octavian's forces advanced and supplies dwindled, Fulvia's situation grew harder to maintain. What had begun as confidence slowly turned into endurance. Supporters grew tired, resistance weakened. The city of Perugia, where much of this tension gathered, became a place of waiting rather than action. In the end, Fulvia's efforts could not hold. The resistance faded, and she was removed from the center of events, not with spectacle, but with quiet finality. She left Rome, traveling away from the city, whose emotional currents she had once understood so well. When she later met Antony again, after the conflict, the meeting did not carry the gratitude she may have expected. Antony, focused on his own political survival and new alliances, did not see her actions as preservation. He saw them as complications. The war she had entered in loyalty now appeared to him as a problem that needed careful repair. For Fulvia, this was perhaps the heaviest moment of all. Not the loss of the conflict, and not the retreat from Rome, but the realization that the man for whom she had acted so steadily did not fully understand why she had done it. Her refusal to remain silent had pulled her into a war, and in the end, she stood alone in her responsibility for it. She did not return to Rome in triumph. She did not return at all. Far from the city, her health declined, and her life came quietly to an end. Rome, busy with new alliances and new tensions, continued forward without pausing to reflect on the woman who had once tried to steady it, simply by stepping forward when others stepped back. Fulvia's story settled into memory, not as scandal, but as something more subtle. She had shown that loyalty, when carried too far, could lead a person into places they never expected to go. She believed that presence could prevent collapse, only to discover that Rome's stability was always shifting beneath her feet. In the calm that followed, the city returned to its familiar rhythm. Crowds gathered in the forum, senators debated, armies prepared for distant campaigns, and somewhere in that background remained the faint memory of a woman who had believed that standing forward was the right way to protect what she cared about. But in Rome, influence did not always belong to those who stepped into the open, and others would soon demonstrate how power could be shaped far more quietly from the shadows. In Rome, some children were raised with expectations, but Julia was raised as a symbol. From the moment she could walk beside her father in public, people did not see a girl. They saw the living proof of Emperor Augustus's vision for Rome. She was meant to represent modesty, discipline, and the quiet dignity of the new moral order her father was trying to build. Wherever she appeared, she carried not only her own presence, but the weight of laws, speeches, and ideals that had been carefully crafted long before she understood them. Servants watched how she spoke, citizens noticed how she dressed, senators paid attention to who stood near her. Julia's life unfolded beneath a gaze that never relaxed. Augustus believed deeply that Rome could be guided not only by armies and decrees, but by example. And Julia, his only daughter, became that example whether she wished to or not. She was married young, then married again, each union arranged not for affection but for political balance. Her personal life became a tool for maintaining stability among powerful men. She learned early that her feelings were less important than the image she projected. Smiles were expected, obedience was expected, silence was expected. For many years, Julia fulfilled this role with grace. She appeared in public ceremonies, stood beside her husbands without complaint, and moved through the palace with the calm posture expected of her. But inside, something slowly shifted. The more she was treated as a symbol rather than a person, the more she began to feel the distance between who she was and who she was supposed to be. Rome at this time was filled with strict moral laws introduced by Augustus himself. Marriage was regulated, behavior was judged, public virtue became a matter of state interest. Julia, who had been shaped into the image of these laws, began to move quietly against them, not with speeches or protests, but with choices made in private spaces. She formed relationships that did not align with the moral order her father promoted. She spent time in company that was considered inappropriate. What began as small acts of personal freedom slowly grew into patterns that could not remain hidden. People began to talk, not loudly, but persistently. The emperor's daughter, the symbol of Roman virtue, seemed to be living a life that contradicted everything Augustus had tried to teach the city. The contrast between the image and the reality became too noticeable to ignore. Senators whispered, friends grew cautious. The palace, always sensitive to reputation, began to feel uneasy. For Julia, these actions may not have felt like rebellion at first. They may have felt like breathing after years of being held still. But in Rome, personal choices made by someone so visible were never truly personal. They became statements, whether intended or not. Eventually, the whispers reached Augustus in a form he could not dismiss. He was not simply a father hearing rumors about his daughter. He was an emperor hearing that the symbol of his moral reforms had quietly stepped outside them. The situation placed him in an impossible position. If he ignored it, his laws would appear hollow. If he acted, he would be punishing his own child. He chose the empire. Julia was accused publicly of immoral conduct and sentenced to exile. There was no dramatic confrontation, no emotional appeal. The decision was presented as necessary, measured, and final. She was sent away to a small island, far from Rome, far from the gaze that had followed her since childhood. In exile, the noise of expectation faded. There were no ceremonies, no observers, no symbols to uphold, only long days, quiet surroundings, and the slow realization that the freedom she had sought now existed in a form she had never intended. Rome continued without her, adjusting easily to her absence. The image of virtue was replaced by new examples, and the story of Julia became a cautionary tale told in softened voices. Her life in exile was not filled with drama. It was filled with distance, distance from her father, from the city, from the role she had been forced to play. The symbol had been removed, and what remained was simply a woman who had wanted to live as herself rather than as an idea. In Rome, control and freedom often pulled against each other quietly, shaping lives without visible struggle. Julia's story became a gentle reminder that even those raised to represent perfection could feel the weight of that role too heavily to carry. And while some women would challenge power by stepping into the open, others would learn that influence could be exercised far more effectively without being seen at all. In Rome, most women learned that silence kept them safe, but Fulvia seemed to believe the opposite, that silence allowed things to fall apart. Long before she became known as the wife of Mark Antony, she was already known as someone who stepped forward when others stepped back. She did not raise her voice, and she did not seek attention, but she had a way of remaining present in moments when tension filled the air, as though she felt responsible for what might happen next. Rome, which was accustomed to women fading quietly into the background of political life, did not quite know what to make of her. Fulvia had lived through enough unrest to understand how quickly public order in Rome could change. Riots, speeches, trials, and sudden shifts of loyalty were part of the city's rhythm. She listened carefully to debates in the forum. She watched how crowds responded to certain names. Over time, she developed a sense for the emotional currents of Rome. The way unease could gather long before it became visible. When Julius Caesar was killed and the city fell into uncertainty, Fulvia did not treat it as distant politics. She felt it as something immediate, something that required presence rather than distance. When Antony emerged as one of the central figures in the struggle for control, Fulvia remained beside him, not as decoration, but as quiet support. She appeared in public with him, listened to conversations, and allowed her presence to be noticed without forcing it. This persistence made her familiar to people in a way that felt unusual for a woman in her position. She became associated with Antony's name not through speeches, but through simple, steady visibility. As tensions grew between Antony and Octavian, the atmosphere in Rome began to tighten. Antony spent more time away from the city, focused on wider campaigns, while uncertainty at home grew heavier. Supporters of Antony became restless. Rumors spread. People began to wonder who was truly guiding events inside the city, while its most powerful men were elsewhere. Fulvia did not wait for clarity. She began speaking quietly with those who still felt loyal to Antony. Veterans, local leaders, old allies. She met them in calm conversations, reminding them of shared history and past promises. She did not speak of rebellion, she spoke of preservation, of holding things steady until Antony returned. These conversations slowly turned into something more organized. Supplies were gathered, groups of supporters formed. What had begun as emotional loyalty took on the shape of practical action. To many Romans, it felt strange to see a woman connected so closely to preparations that resembled military effort. Yet Fulvia never presented herself as a commander. She spoke as someone safeguarding Antony's place in Rome during his absence. This framing allowed her actions to seem less like defiance and more like duty, even as the situation gradually moved toward open conflict. Eventually, the tension broke into what later became known as the Perusian War. Cities were drawn into the dispute, troops maneuvered, negotiations failed. Through it all, Fulvia remained calm and visible, believing that maintaining pressure would force Antony's rivals to reconsider their position. She trusted that loyalty and persistence would be enough to hold things together. But war does not respond gently to intention. As Octavian's forces advanced and supplies dwindled, Fulvia's situation grew harder to maintain. What had begun as confidence slowly turned into endurance. Supporters grew tired, resistance weakened. The city of Perugia, where much of this tension gathered, became a place of waiting rather than action. In the end, Fulvia's efforts could not hold. The resistance faded, and she was removed from the center of events, not with spectacle, but with quiet finality. She left Rome, traveling away from the city whose emotional currents she had once understood so well. When she later met Antony again after the conflict, the meeting did not carry the gratitude she may have expected. Antony, focused on his own political survival and new alliances, did not see her actions as preservation. He saw them as complications. The war she had entered in loyalty now appeared to him as a problem that needed careful repair. For Fulvia, this was perhaps the heaviest moment of all, not the loss of the conflict, and not the retreat from Rome, but the realization that the man for whom she had acted so steadily did not fully understand why she had done it. Her refusal to remain silent had pulled her into a war, and in the end she stood alone in her responsibility for it. She did not return to Rome in triumph. She did not return at all. Far from the city, her health declined, and her life came quietly to an end. Rome, busy with new alliances and new tensions, continued forward without pausing to reflect on the woman who had once tried to steady it simply by stepping forward when others stepped back. Fulvia's story settled into memory, not as scandal, but as something more subtle. She had shown that loyalty, when carried too far, could lead a person into places they never expected to go. She believed that presence could prevent collapse, only to discover that Rome's stability was always shifting beneath her feet. In the calm that followed, the city returned to its familiar rhythm. Crowds gathered in the forum, senators debated, armies prepared for distant campaigns, and somewhere in that background remained a faint memory of a woman who had believed that standing forward was the right way to protect what she cared about. But in Rome, influence did not always belong to those who stepped into the open, and others would soon demonstrate how power could be shaped far more quietly from the shadows. In Rome, there was once a woman who had never been allowed to be a person. From childhood, she had been an example. Her name was Julia, the only daughter of Emperor Augustus, and before she understood what Rome expected from her, Rome had already decided who she was supposed to be. She was raised not as a child, but as a living symbol of discipline, modesty, and moral perfection. Wherever she walked, people did not see Julia. They saw the proof that Augustus's new Rome was working. She learned to smile when required, to stand beside husbands chosen for her, and to move through ceremonies with calm obedience. Her life unfolded beneath constant observation. Servants watched how she dressed. Senators noticed who spoke to her. Citizens whispered about her posture, her gestures, her expressions. Julia's existence was never private. It was a performance written long before she could read it. Augustus believed that Rome could be guided by example, and Julia became that example whether she wished to or not. She was married for alliances, widowed, then married again, each time adjusting to a role designed for political balance rather than personal comfort. Years passed in this quiet obedience, but inside her, a slow tension grew between the image she carried and the person she felt herself to be. Rome at this time was filled with strict moral laws created by Augustus himself. Behavior was regulated, marriage was monitored, public virtue became a matter of state pride. Julia, who had been shaped into the image of these laws, began to move gently outside them, not loudly, not rebelliously, simply through private choices that felt like breathing after years of stillness. She spent time with people her father would not have approved of. She formed relationships that did not match the moral picture she represented. What began as small acts of personal freedom slowly formed patterns that could not remain hidden. The contrast between the symbol and the woman grew too visible. People began to whisper, not with excitement but with discomfort. The emperor's daughter, the living example of Roman virtue, appeared to be living a life that contradicted everything Augustus had tried to teach the city. The palace grew uneasy, friends grew cautious. Conversation softened when she entered a room. Eventually, the whispers reached Augustus in a form he could not ignore. He was not simply a father hearing rumors. He was an emperor hearing that the symbol of his moral order had quietly stepped outside it. He faced a choice between protecting his daughter and protecting the image of Rome he had built. He chose Rome. Julia was accused publicly of immoral conduct and sentenced to exile. There were no dramatic arguments, no emotional pleas. The decision was calm, official, and final. She was sent away to a small island, far from the gaze that had followed her since childhood. In exile, something unusual happened. For the first time in her life, no one was watching. No one expected anything. No one required her to represent an idea. The silence she had once feared became the only space where she could exist without performance. Rome continued easily without her. The symbol was replaced. The story of Julia became a quiet warning, told in softened voices, about what happens when personal freedom collides with public expectation. Her life settled into distance, not drama, distance from the palace, distance from her father, distance from the role she had carried for so long. In Rome, control and freedom often moved against each other invisibly, shaping lives without open conflict. Julia's story became a gentle reminder that even those raised to represent perfection could feel the weight of that role too heavily to carry. And while some women would resist power by stepping into the open, others would discover that influence could be exercised far more effectively without ever being seen. In the same palace where Julia struggled beneath constant visibility, another woman perfected the art of being almost invisible. Her name was Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, and from the outside she appeared to be the ideal Roman matron. Calm, modest, dignified, and entirely devoted to her husband. She moved through the palace without hurry, without noise, and without drawing attention to herself. People trusted her stillness. They admired her composure in a place filled with tension. Livia seemed to create calm simply by existing. But Livia understood something very few others did. In Rome, Power did not always belong to the loudest voice. Sometimes it belonged to the person who listened the longest. She spent years beside Augustus, observing how decisions were made, how alliances shifted, and how easily fortunes changed. She did not interrupt, she did not argue when she spoke. It was gently, framed as concern or practical thought. Over time, Augustus grew used to hearing her perspective. Her opinions blended so naturally into his own that it became difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. To Rome, Augustus ruled alone. Inside the palace, many sensed that Livia's presence quietly shaped much of what he decided. Succession was always a delicate matter. Augustus had several young heirs over the years, each one carefully prepared to follow him. Yet, one by one, these heirs died unexpectedly or fell out of favor. Illness, accidents, political complications, each reason plausible, each accepted without public protest. But over time, a pattern formed in the minds of those who watched closely. Livia's own son, Tiberius, remained constant through all of this. He was not Augustus's first choice, nor even his second. But as other options faded, Tiberius remained steady, present, and dependable. Livia never pushed his name forward. She never demanded recognition. She simply ensured that he was always nearby when questions of succession arose. Years passed in this quiet rearrangement. Augustus aged. The question of who would follow him grew heavier, and almost without anyone noticing how it had happened, Tiberius stood as the most logical successor, not because he had been loudly promoted, but because every other possibility had gently disappeared. When Augustus finally died, Rome mourned with solemn ceremony. Officially, it was age and natural decline, yet whispers moved softly through the city, wondering whether his final days had been guided too carefully, whether certain meals had been prepared with unusual attention, whether Livia's calm presence had been more than comforting. Nothing was proven, nothing was said aloud, but the timing felt precise enough to leave a faint question in the air. Tiberius became emperor. Livia did not step forward for recognition. She remained exactly where she had always been, in the background, her influence already complete. The transition appeared smooth, natural, almost effortless. Only afterward did people begin to reflect on how little they had noticed while it was happening. Livia had never demanded power. She had simply remained present long enough for power to arrange itself around her wishes. Her story stayed in Rome, not as scandal, but as a lesson in patience. She had shown that the most effective influence was the kind that left no visible trace, that reshaped a future so quietly that no one felt it happening. In a world where others stepped into the light and were consumed by it, Livia remained in the shade, allowing events to unfold exactly as she needed them to. And for those paying attention, it became clear that some women in Rome did not challenge power at all. They simply waited long enough for power to come gently toward them. In Rome, there was once a woman who believed she was trying to save the empire from her own brother. Her name was Lucilla, daughter of Marcus Aurelius and sister of Commodus, and she had grown up inside a palace shaped by philosophy, restraint, and quiet responsibility. As a child, she had listened to her father speak about duty and balance, about how power should be carried carefully, almost gently. She assumed, as many did, that this calm rhythm would continue after him. But when Commodus became emperor, the atmosphere inside the palace changed. The steady tone of thoughtful rule was replaced by something restless and unpredictable. Commodus preferred spectacle to reflection, impulse to restraint. Lucilla watched this change from very close by, not as a distant observer, but as family. She could see how quickly the careful world her father had built was beginning to feel unstable. At first, her concern was quiet. She spoke softly with people she trusted, with senators who remembered Marcus Aurelius, with advisers who had grown uneasy. These were not bold meetings, they were hesitant conversations, filled with long pauses. No one wanted to speak too directly, but everyone sensed the same unease. Gradually, the idea formed that if Commodus could not be guided back toward reason, he might need to be removed. This thought did not feel like rebellion to them. It felt like protection. Lucilla's role was not commanding. She provided connection and trust. The sense that this action came from loyalty rather than ambition. The plan itself was simple. During a public moment, an assassin would approach Commodus quietly and end his rule in an instant. But when the moment arrived, hesitation broke the simplicity. The assassin spoke aloud instead of acting, and in that small delay, everything collapsed. Guards intervened, confusion replaced intention. The plan unraveled in seconds. Arrests followed quickly. Names were revealed. Lucilla's involvement became known. The palace that had once been familiar now felt narrow and watchful. Commodus, who had once shared her childhood, now saw her only as a threat. She was first sent into exile, removed from Rome and from the network of people who had trusted her. Later, the decision was made to end her life quietly, away from public attention. There was no spectacle, no speech, only a still conclusion. Lucilla's story ended not in drama, but in silence. A woman who believed she was preserving Rome was removed by the very system she had hoped to protect. In the calm that followed, Commodus continued to rule. Servants whispered, senators adjusted, and Lucilla became another memory carried softly through the palace corridors. Her story lingered as a reminder that in Rome, even actions taken out of loyalty could be judged as betrayal, and even those closest to power were never beyond danger. But not all women inside the palace would try to change power through action. Some would learn to shape it through presence alone. In Rome, there was once a woman who understood that being seen could be a form of influence. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and long before she became empress, people noticed the calm confidence with which she moved. She did not seek attention, yet attention seemed to settle naturally around her. She understood how presence could shape emotion without words. When she entered Nero's world, she quickly recognized the instability surrounding him. Nero was young, sensitive, and easily influenced by those who made him feel understood. Poppaea offered admiration, agreement, and a sense of comfort that he rarely found elsewhere. At the time, Nero was married to Octavia, a woman loved by the Roman people for her quiet dignity. Poppaea did not challenge this directly. She allowed her presence to grow slowly, becoming familiar, reassuring, and increasingly important in Nero's daily life. Over time, preference replaced obligation. Nero began to see Octavia as distant, and Poppaea as essential. Accusations formed quietly. Octavia was removed from the palace, under charges few believed, but none could resist. Soon after, she was executed. Poppaea became empress. For a while, everything seemed settled. She stood beside Nero with grace, influencing him through calm words rather than demand. She did not appear political, she appeared personal, and that personal connection gave her unusual power. But Nero's emotions shifted quickly. Affection could turn into anger without warning. One evening, during an argument that began over something small, Nero struck Poppaea in frustration. She was pregnant. The blow, careless and sudden, ended her life. Her death shocked even those accustomed to the strange events of Nero's court. There was no plot, no careful planning, only a moment of uncontrolled emotion. Rome absorbed the story quietly. Poppea, who had risen through understanding Nero's nature, had been undone by that same unpredictability. Her memory lingered as a soft warning that even those who seemed to navigate power perfectly could not always control the emotions of the person who held it, and others would learn that survival sometimes required something more enduring than beauty or influence. There was a woman in Rome whose story was not shaped by scandal or ambition, but by endurance. Her name was Domitia Longina, wife of Emperor Domitian, and her life inside the palace was defined by careful survival. Domitian ruled with suspicion and sudden shifts of mood. Living beside him required constant attention to tone, timing, and silence. At first, Domitia held a respected place beside him, appearing in ceremonies and fulfilling the duties expected of an empress. But, over time, Domitian's distrust turned toward her as well. She was sent away from the palace without clear explanation, removed from her role as though she had quietly become inconvenient. Exile brought distance from the tension that had filled her days. Yet after some time, Domitian called her back. Whether out of loneliness or shifting suspicion, he restored her position as though nothing had happened. Domitia returned carefully, understanding that survival required adaptability rather than resistance. She resumed her place beside him, moving through the same spaces with a deeper awareness of how fragile her position was. As Domitian's rule grew harsher, fear spread quietly through the palace. Conspiracies formed among those who believed he had become too dangerous. Domitia was aware of these tensions, but did not step forward. She simply remained present when Domitian was finally assassinated. It happened quickly inside the palace itself, and when it was over, Domitia was still alive, standing where many others had fallen. She did not claim credit, she did not speak, she simply endured. Rome moved on, the palace grew calmer. Domitia's survival became the quiet conclusion to a life spent navigating danger through patience, rather than confrontation. Her story remained as a gentle reminder that sometimes the greatest form of influence was not changing events, but lasting long enough to see them change on their own. And as the palace settled once more into calm, it became clear that some women in Rome did not need to challenge power directly. They only needed to outlast it. There was an empress in Rome whose rooms were known not for decoration, but for conversation spoken in low, thoughtful tones. Her name was Julia Domna, and people who entered her presence often found themselves speaking more slowly without realizing why. While other parts of the palace felt tense and watchful, her space felt different. Philosophers gathered there, writers rested there, ideas moved gently between people like quiet air. It was said that time passed differently around her. She had come from Syria to Rome as the wife of Septimius Severus, and from the beginning she understood that empires were not held together by force alone. They were held together by rhythm, by continuity, by the feeling that someone steady was always present. When Severus ruled, Julia traveled beside him, listened beside him, and helped soften the sharp edges of command with patience. She remembered names, she remembered concerns. She made the large machinery of empire feel human to those inside it. After his death, power passed to their sons, Caracalla and Geta. Almost immediately, tension grew between them. Julia found herself standing between her own children, speaking calmly to both, hoping words could do what authority could not. But rivalry is not easily softened. When Caracalla had Geta killed, something inside the palace changed permanently. Julia continued her duties, continued her correspondence, continued the quiet routine that allowed Rome to function. But she now carried a silence that had not been there before. She lived beside the son who had murdered the other, and still she maintained the daily rhythm of the court. Officials depended on her steadiness, messengers depended on her clarity, the empire, without noticing, depended on her calm. But calm, when carried too long, becomes heavy. When Caracalla himself was assassinated during a campaign far from Rome, Julia found herself without sons, without position, and without the structure she had spent years maintaining. In that distant place, she made no announcement. She simply stopped eating. Day after day, she grew lighter, as if slowly releasing the weight she had carried for so long. There was no drama in her decision, only quiet release. Her death arrived gently, like the end of a long effort finally set down. And after Julia Domna, the stories of Rome began to feel less tense, as if the empire itself is learning how to breathe more slowly. There was once a young woman in Rome who was loved simply because she seemed kind. Her name was Claudia Octavia, and people felt calm when they saw her standing beside Nero. She spoke little, she moved carefully, she fulfilled every expectation placed upon her without complaint. In a palace, often filled with emotion, her quiet presence felt reassuring. But Nero's attention drifted elsewhere, toward Papatia Sabina, and Octavia's gentleness slowly became inconvenient. Rumors appeared around her, not loud, not convincing, but persistent enough to create distance. She was accused first of infertility, then of betrayal. None of it felt real, yet all of it was accepted eventually. She was removed from the palace and sent into exile. Far from Rome, Octavia waited without knowing what would happen next. She had done nothing wrong, yet she understood that innocence did not always protect anyone inside the imperial family. The order, when it came, was quiet and final. She was executed away from the city that had once admired her. There was no spectacle in her death, only a soft sadness that lingered among those who remembered her calmness. Octavia had followed every rule, met every expectation, and still found herself removed when she became unnecessary. Her story settled into memory like a gentle sigh, and after Octavia, the stories of Rome began to feel even quieter, as if moving toward rest. Long before emperors and palaces, there was a woman in Rome whose influence came from teaching. Her name was Cornelia Africana, and her home was known as a place where children learned to think carefully. She believed that shaping the mind was more important than shaping events. She raised her sons, Tiberius and Gaius, with patience, speaking to them about fairness, responsibility, and care for others. Her house was calm, conversations were thoughtful, time moved gently there. As her sons grew, they carried her lessons into public life, speaking about reform and justice. Many people listened, others felt uneasy. Both sons were eventually killed in political violence because of the ideals they pursued. Cornelia lived long enough to see them fall. She did not speak with anger about their deaths. She spoke about their intentions, remembering the thoughts they had carried rather than the way they had died. Her later years were quiet, filled with memory and reflection. She became known not for tragedy, but for dignity. Cornelia's story remains like a soft echo from an earlier Rome, a reminder that influence can be gentle and lasting. And as her life faded naturally into stillness, the voices of these Roman women seemed to grow distant, like footsteps moving away down a quiet corridor, leaving only calm behind. Near the end of Commodus's rule, there was a woman who spent many quiet evenings in the same room as the emperor, listening to the way he breathed when he thought no one was paying attention. Her name was Marcia. She was not known for ambition or influence. She was known for being present, for sitting nearby, for speaking softly when words were needed, and remaining silent when they were not. In those final years, Commodus rarely seemed at ease. Even in private, there was a restlessness to him, a feeling that his thoughts never settled. Marcia noticed this, not as an observer of politics, but as someone who shared the same space night after night. She learned the rhythm of his moods, the long silences, the sudden irritation, the way he would grow suspicious of things that had once felt familiar. Living beside him required no strategy, only careful awareness. The palace around them had grown tense over time. People walked more quietly. Conversations ended when footsteps approached. No one felt certain about what the next day might bring. Marcia felt this too, though she rarely spoke of it. She simply remained close, watching, listening, sensing the weight that seemed to follow Commodus wherever he went. Others inside the palace began to share the same unspoken concern. Not loudly, not urgently, just a quiet understanding that something felt wrong and that the tension had lasted too long. Marcia did not lead these thoughts. She did not resist them either. She understood, perhaps better than most, how tired the palace had become. On the night it happened, nothing felt unusual at first. Commodus retired to his rooms as he always did. The lamps were low. The air was still. Marcia moved through the familiar pattern of the evening without hurry. A drink was prepared. Words were exchanged softly. Time moved slowly, almost gently. When the poison did not work quickly enough, another step was taken, quiet and close, without noise or struggle. And then there was stillness. No announcement followed, no sudden movement, only a gradual awareness that the tension which had filled the palace for years had quietly lifted. Marcia remained where she was, listening to the silence that followed. It felt different from the silences she had known before. Lighter, easier to breathe inside. Servants walked more calmly the next morning. Guards spoke in lower tones. The heavy watchfulness that had shaped daily life began to fade without anyone needing to mention it. Marcia's part in this was never loudly discussed. It existed as a quiet understanding among those who had been nearby. She had lived close to a man who could not find rest, and in the end, she helped bring a kind of rest back to the place around him. There is no dramatic ending to her story, no final statement, only the feeling of a long tension gently dissolving. And as her presence fades from view, the palace itself seems to grow distant, like a memory becoming softer and less defined. The voices of these women, once so near to power, now feel far away. Their footsteps echo faintly through long corridors, then fade, and what remains is only quiet.